is Tina Ruggieri. I am the assistant curator at the Abrams Engel Institute for the Visual Arts, located at the University of Alabama at Birmingham's campus. I'm excited to be here today with artist Deborah Brown. Deborah was born in 1955, and she currently lives and works in New York City. She received a BA from Yale University and her MFA from Indiana University in Bloomington. Deborah's work is in line with the rich tradition of figurative painting. She uses herself and dogs often as muses for her works. More times than not, the image of the female nude is used as an autobiographical device. Her paintings offer a narrative that you can inhabit the space with the subject, and oftentimes we see the woman with her dog as a companion. Deborah has had exhibitions at galleries and museums such as Gablack in Palm Beach, the Lodge in Los Angeles, the Painting Center in New York, and the Institute for Contemporary Art at Maine College of Art in Portland, Maine, Mullen Gallery in New York, and that is just to name a few. Deborah, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's my pleasure, Tina. I've enjoyed listening to the conversations you've been having with other artists during the lockdown.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the compliment. I also didn't want to go into too much detail about your work because I really want everyone to hear from you about the work. So first, I want to discuss the works you were making before quarantine. You've given me 3 examples that we can talk about. These works all show women, a lone woman, exploring nature with her dog as a companion. Can you give us insight into this body of work and what you were exploring?
Well, I began this work maybe 5 years ago when I started using my experiences in this industrial area where I have my studio. Even though these are very pastoral looking images, they had their origin in my real life experiences in my neighborhood. It's an industrial business zone in Brooklyn, in East Williamsburg. And I found a lot in my walkings around with my 2 dogs, other dogs and birds, abandoned or runaways. And so I did a series of paintings based on these discoveries and showed this work in New York at a small gallery called Ruggieri. And this was in 2017. So the images showed a woman in this kind of quasi-industrial area with kind of ruined nature, and she was having adventures with dogs and birds. It was kind of ambiguous what the narrative was, but they really were based on things that had happened to me. I found several of my dogs in my neighborhood and several of my birds, parakeets, pigeons, escaped partridges from the local slaughterhouse. So it was really, the impetus was something very personal. Mm-hmm. And as I began to work on this work, I changed the protagonist and made her a nude figure. So that really changed the dynamic quite a bit and became more of a reference for mythological subjects, biblical subjects, subjects in art history, mythological subjects. And this painting that we're seeing on the screen right now, which is called Danae and Zeus, is based on the myth of Danae, who is a nymph and who was hanging out and was approached by Zeus, who apparently had his eye on her, the god Zeus, and he came as a golden shower to impregnate her, actually. So this is a subject that's is found in classical art, like Titian, and I forget, lots of artists, I'm sure, whom you know, have depicted this. And so I kind of did a modern day spin on it. Zeus was the name of my Jack Russell. So Zeus is pictured along with Danae, the protagonist, and she's giving sort of the hairy eyeball or a kind of quizzical or somewhat skeptical stare at what's going on behind the tree. So this was my way, I think, of launching a body of work which would use the nude female figure painted by me, a woman, to kind of visit these classical subjects. Once I had taken off the clothes of this female protagonist, she became many different things. An empowered female, a bather, someone who could reenact these classical subjects, maybe someone you could identify with as a woman. It really was a kind of open-ended projects. And the paintings took away from my immediate surroundings and became much more pastoral. And sometimes she was in a swamp, sometimes she was at the beach. It really became a kind of liberating narrative. At least that was the way I had thought of it.
So I understand that a lot of these are imagined nature scenes. So what is your, like, have you ever been to some of these places? Or are they all completely imaginary or based on anything in real life?
It's kind of both. I mean, at this point, my nature is really very much imagined because I live in the most unnatural place in the world.
Yeah.
I mean, we have some kind of what I call ruined nature around, where there are honeysuckle vines growing on barbed wire fences and things like that, kind of surprising things. And actually, the city has built a lot of bioswales to catch the natural rain runoff in the industrial business zone. And so side by side with these, like most industrial users you can imagine, are these wonderful bioswales that are planted with very sustainable landscaping in these little tree boxes, and they're really beautiful. But most of the nature that I use in my paintings is from my imagination. I use other kinds of art sources, like in the Donna and Zeus painting, I was looking at a lot of Claude Lorrain brush and ink studies. I mean, he's a 17th century artist, but he did the most incredible modern looking nature studies that are just gorgeous and lush and beautiful. And so I used artists whose work I admired as kind of the backdrop in a lot of these. But I do have a long like history as an artist, and in the early part of our career, I taught at Carleton College in Minnesota, and I did a lot of plein air painting. And I would go out at all times of the year, including in the winter, which was really not easy when it's very cold in Minnesota, and I would paint on the site. And so I do have a huge repertoire of references from having painted in nature. And as we'll see in one of the canoe paintings coming up, I did canoe a lot in the Boundary Waters, which is a wilderness area on the border of Canada and Minnesota. And it's very beautiful. You have to portage your way in a canoe. Portaging means, you hold the canoe on your back with a big Duluth pack, and you camp and walk and canoe into areas that are just pristine and gorgeous. So I have a lot of camping experience, like in the Midwest, Western U.S. and in northern Minnesota, and then this plein air painting experience, which I've kind of husbanded away in my imagination and then brought out in paintings that I worked on in this series. So it's a combination of my own experience, looking at other people's work whose depictions of nature I admired.
That's what I love about the work. It is your personal experience. It's imaginative. It's based in art history. It's based in just all these different factors that bring it together as your own unique visual language for these works. Can you discuss how your work historically relates to the history of the female nude and how it contradicts the idea of the male gaze?
Well, that's a really thorny issue, because I think, unlike maybe some contemporary female artists who are, like you interviewed Shona McAndrew, whose work I think is really great, she has a very specific take on that subject. And mine is really not quite so, I think, obvious in its intent to critique. I think it's just empowering for me as an artist to take on this subject, which I think is just, until rather recently, been exclusively the province of male artists. And you have the sense in my paintings that this this protagonist is looking back at you, and not just for the delectation of a male gaze. I don't know how to exactly say that that's so. Maybe it's just that I feel it's so, but maybe it's her frank comfort with her nakedness, that she's not on display really for anyone. It's really more that she's doing her own thing in nature, and her animals are her companions. Maybe they might even be men that she's turned into dogs or animals and subjugated in some way as part of her own hierarchical domain in which she rules. So I think it's more an attitude, and it isn't. I don't think I'm using explicit cues and tropes to tip you off, but it's more, I think, the sense that you feel in her confidence and her going about her business, that you sense that this is not made by a man. And I could be wrong, but I think probably because of my age, I'm just working within a tradition of painting that maybe doesn't use the most obvious clues
Yeah.
to create meaning, but that if you're alert, you can sense it.
Yeah, and a lot of that might be what I'm bringing and reading into the work, based on just my studies of the female nude in art history, being an art historian, and also looking at art that's coming now, and it's very confronting it. So it is something that I bring to the table that I think about when I look at a female nude. But yours are very much comfortable with their nudity. It is very much, they don't even notice that we're here looking at them. And that's what I love about it. It's all about just them in their moment and appreciating who they are, and no worries about who we are. If that makes sense.
And I think there's a sense, because there are very few elements of civilization, it's as if this person, this protagonist, has created her own world, which does not rely on these other kinds of props. I mean, especially in the Lewis, I wanted to give her a vehicle where she could go places, and but there's very little information about where this is actually taking place. So it's, I think it has a kind of simultaneous immediacy and also a dreamlike quality, in which I mean, she could be someone who exists, but she also could be a kind of death maiden who's ferrying people, from the one bank of the Sharon River to the other, to the afterworld. It has this mythological quality, I think, and also a contemporary quality. And I think that's what connects it to art history and also to now. At least that's my hope.
I think it does. That's why I've been drawn to it, from my personal standpoint. So I want to move into some of the works you've been creating during quarantine. How has your just situation during this time of isolation informed this new body of work?
Well, this work actually came out of an immediate need, which is I'm co-curating a show called Sit Still, Self-Portraits in the Age of Distraction, with another artist, Patty Horing, who is a wonderful artist who is represented by Anna Zarina Gallery. And she came up with this idea about a year and a half ago. So she's had it in her head for a long time, and she got her dealer, Anna, to get on board with doing a group show for 2020 over the summer. And as she was going through curation, she asked me to be in the show, and then she asked me to curate it with her. So it's really her idea, and because I'm a figurative artist and know artists my age and also much younger, I think she thought that I would bring a group of artists to the show, and it would add to the artists that she knew. And the two of us have put together this great show. It is going to happen in real life. The open hours have yet to be determined, but it's going to open on the 18th of June and run through the summer at Anna Zarina's. There are 29 artists, and about, I would say half the artists in the show are artists of color, many women, young, old. It's a fantastic show.
I can't wait to see it.
We were doing a lot of studio visits right up until March 15th when things shut down. So I've seen almost all the work in person, but not all of it, because we had to continue some of the studio visits virtually after the quarantine. But so this is the backdrop of these self-portraits. I had been aware that I was going to be in this show, and I'd obviously taken an active role in the curation, but I had kind of dilly-dallied and gone back and forth about how I would actually do a self-portrait, because my paintings are self-figures, at least up until the very recent work, but they hadn't been explicitly self-portraits. So before this body of work that we're discussing right now that's on the screen, I had tried to put myself in the canoe paintings, as this explicitly me, and it just really didn't work. I actually hated them. And so being in lockdown had and I had just delivered a whole body of work to Sarah Gavlak for a show in Palm Beach. She had taken my work to the Armory show, and then following Armory, on Sunday of Armory, the movers came over and they took all the work down. And so all my work in my studio that I had done very recently was gone. And so I can really focus on this self-portrait business exclusively. I started to do that. I started to do some of the pieces that are behind me. You can see on the wall, the one to this one was one of the first ones. And I just dove in. I started working on these small paintings on masonite. And for people who know what masonite is, it's a very smooth surface. This is the first one I did. and you kind of just zip along with the paint. You can rework and rework, but it doesn't really lend itself to that. It's a very immediate surface because it's very non-absorbent. So if you work on oil on masonite with oil on masonite, you really get a kind of alla prima effect where the paint sits on the surface. It's really fun. Kind of low stakes where you can, if you don't like it, you can wipe it out and start over again really easily. I started in with these portraits. I took my dog Zeus, who recently died. It's kind of a memorial to him, and I made this painting up out of my imagination. I didn't use a mirror. So although I am older than this painting makes me look, it is my idea of me and explicitly me. And this just really hit. For some reason, I liked it, other people liked it, and I just was off to the races. I think because of all the effect of the quarantine, it really lent itself to a kind of introspection. And I didn't use a mirror. I just kind of painted my sense of what I look like. And this led to a whole series of self-portraits in which you can see it's the same person, but probably doesn't look very much exactly the same from painting to painting. So the earliest ones were these, and I began Trout, other dog who's still alive, and I used the paintings. You can see the canoe painting in the background.
Yeah.
There's the nude figure. There's Zeus, like in the water. There's a sliver of a canoe. This is really my chair, which you can see.
Oh yeah, I love it.
Heard a long time ago. So there are. Like, these are the things in my immediate environment. So I used those as the backdrop, and I thought, this is really, I don't know if I thought it was clever, but I thought it was fun.
Yeah.
It looked like maybe this person, me, was imagining these paintings that I had in fact made. So it was this series of little rabbit holes and going down paths that reference the immediate work that I had done, the things in my surroundings, my animals as mine, my dogs, the dogs I had found on the street, and it sort of put it all together. And I was really excited and energized by this. And in quarantine, as you know, it's great to have a sort of a new project. And
definitely. I want to just ask you, just how do you go about creating these paintings? Because you have very loose brushwork, yet in some areas it's a little bit tighter, but still kind of abstracted. So you could almost take any section of this painting and have a complete abstract painting.
Yeah, I think it's easier to do that with the non-figural parts. Like I'm pretty good with that with the dogs and with the decorative stuff that's in the paintings, like the rugs and then my paintings of my paintings.
Yeah.
This is actually based on a real room that is in this warehouse where I have my studio. The previous owner had left this great clawfoot bathtub, which is incredible. And I have put all this artwork, actually not my own artwork. This is a artistic license in this painting, but the room is filled with other people's artwork, things I've been given by other artists, work I've bought. So it's filled with small paintings that go salon style all over the wall. And then there are plants because it's in front of a glass block wall. And so the plants get the natural light. So it is really a very cool little room that has all this unusual stuff in it that is actually quite personal. So I found it easier. This is totally remembered image. It's not based on photographs. It's easier for me to paint the things that are in the background and with this kind of interpretive style, because I'm just throwing in all these things I know exist and I know them pretty well from my imagination, but I have to invent in painting what they should look like in the painting. So I let my hand wander around and I use a variety of house painter size brushes, maybe 3 or 4 inches for things like the walls and the floor. And then a more linear type brush for the things that I do the lines with. The leaves on the plant or some of the details of the painting, the paintings in the background. And then for the expression on the figure's face. And I think what I'm really going for is something I don't necessarily know until I let my brush move around and the interaction with the painting occur, and then I see it, and then I leave it. So it's
start off very intuitive. It sounds like it's a very intuitive process for you.
It is. I think it is not laid out. I think I am using. It's kind of like a performance. I know a lot about painting. I think just from working many years and having looked at a lot of other people's paintings. And so I see it as a kind of, you step up to the plate and you start, a lot of metaphors here, but you start and you're provoking something. So you're provoking a dialogue with the surface of the painting, with the image you have in mind to begin with, the image that's emerging, the things you've seen in art history, the things you feel.
Yeah.
And I like to think of painting as a representation of consciousness, and it represents the artist's consciousness, and it represents the viewers when the viewer interacts with the painting. Yeah. So you're seeing that unfold as you watch the painting, as you look at the painting, finished painting. But as the artist, when you're creating it, you have that kind of phenomenological representation of what's in your head, what you feel, and you want the painting to represent that in some way. And that's what I think is so exciting about painting. And I think my brushwork in some way provokes that interaction.
Completely. That makes a lot of sense. It's very interesting. And I want to ask you somewhat of an obvious question. So I'm a huge dog lover myself. I have 4 dogs. So what is your interest in our 4-legged friends, and why do you include them in your paintings, and what do they mean to you?
I guess I'm an animal lover. I mean, you are or you aren't.
Yeah.
And, for a long time, I walked dogs at the Humane Society of New York as a volunteer, like for 15 years. I got several of my dogs from there. And in the early 2000s, I actually did a series of paintings called Shelter Dogs, in which I showed in New York. I had 2 shows of this work. The first show was just of the dogs. I remember going and taking Polaroids of them. That's what you had, like a Polaroid camera. And I wove them into a series of paintings. And then the second show was of the dogs and their caregivers at the Humane Society. So I did the people who worked there and people who volunteered there. And it was a kind of a sentimental subject for sure. I don't know how, I got reviewed in the New York Times actually at the time, the first show, the Shelter Dog show, but then I shelved it, as a subject, and it didn't come back into my work until I did The Runaways. So again, provoked by something in my real experience. Most of my painting has been about something that is happening in my life, because I'm a figurative painter and I represent things that really are, not an abstract painter. So I love dogs, and I have this history again as a volunteer dog walker and someone who found dogs in my neighborhood, and I just began to put them into the paintings. It was kind of a no-brainer to do them in the most recent self-portraits, because that's kind of been the focus. They've been my sidekicks and companions, and in the paintings for a while. And this painting that we're looking at is the front of my warehouse in East Williamsburg, and there's a big concrete slab outside which gets you into the building, and then a big steel door with a number scrolled on it. There's the glass block to the right, so the bathroom is just past that, and it's a stucco building. It has a garage with a roll-down grate, so you can see the metal grate on the left-hand side of the painting, and the architecture, the geometry of this facade, which is totally ordinary, and really it looks like a bunker from the outside. It's kind of a bunker, and the light comes across in these shards, and so I'm in a grid, the dogs are in a grid, these organic forms against this architecture of glass and stucco and steel and concrete. And it's kind of the life I'm in, which is I'm in this grid of those things. So it's I feel like this, and then this is this red, used to be called a car coat. I don't know if people call them car coats anymore, but that I bought off a nail on Bogart Street in Bushwick from a seller on the street. So it is a representation of what things look like to me.
It's fat. I love that. This may be one of my favorites. I love it. I love the balance of the red coat and the building, the dogs. One's really ready to go. One looks like he's not so sure. The building itself, but I can relate to this scene, even though I don't. My surroundings look the same. I have 4 dogs. We go for walks multiple times a day, and they're rambunctious, and sometimes they're hesitant, and sometimes they bark, and so all sorts of things. And so I really gravitate towards the dogs in your work. I gravitate a lot towards animals because we share that. I'm a huge animal person. I mean, I know you kind of talked a little bit about how your work has evolved over time. I know that, your earlier work um, was still figurative, but it was a little bit more abstracted. And then you've done dogs and stuff. And I just wanted to see if you could touch a little bit on just your evolution to where you've of your process and your work and your style up into this point.
Well, I've had a really long history as a painter because I've
Yeah.
been looking for, 40 years. I've been in New York almost 40 years. When I was in Minnesota, I mean, I came to my job at Carleton right out of grad school. So I started out as someone who was painting out landscapes outside. I mean, I painted a lot from nature.
Hmm.
So I did that for many years. When I moved to New York in the early 80s, I started working from watercolors that I would do like at the South Street Seaport. I would go out and sit on one of the rotting piers. I mean, this was before New York was Disneyland. I can't even believe that I did that because it was probably so dangerous. But at these abandoned piers, painting like the skyline and different things with watercolors. I would bring watercolors back to my studio and make paintings of them. I was showing at a gallery called Tibor de Nage then, which still exists. And Tibor was still alive. It's like one of the old dealers who had shown Jane Wilson and Jane Freilacher and Fairfield Porter. And so my work kind of looked like that. It was in that tradition. That's why probably they took me on. So I was painting from landscapes from watercolors that I did when I was either in New York on location or in other places that I would bring back into my studio. And then I did a whole series of paintings from photographs from the Natural History Museum. They're great photograph archive of exploration. So I did paintings from photographs of undersea things. That led to a commission from the MTA to do the mosaics at Houston Street. I did the whole station where my paintings got made into mosaics of underwater creatures swimming through the subway. They were made in the early 90s by a mosaic fabricator, but I got this commission, which was a pretty big commission at the time. So I did a whole bunch of public art projects then that led to around the country. The Houston Street subway station is probably the best known because it's been there the longest and the most people have seen it. It's kind of a sentimental favorite because it's humorous. The underwater creatures are swimming through the subway, which is flooded. And that, since that has actually happened during Sandy, it was kind of something that people then photographed and surfaced on social media in the aftermath of the big hurricanes in New York. But when I came to Brooklyn, I moved my studio here in 2005. I still live in Manhattan actually, but my husband and I switched residences in Manhattan. I lost my studio, our loft building, went to something else. And so I came out to Brooklyn and I started working out here and I began painting things around me again. Bushwick was a very different place than it is now. It was not very many young artists. It was a lot of people who had lived here for a long time, different communities of African Americans and Puerto Rican Americans, Dominican Americans. And the landscape was very much the old New York, like very much reminiscent of the 70s and not changed very much. And I went out and drew from and photographed cement factories and shoes hanging from wires across the street and just barbed wire and all kinds of things that were just really kind of reminiscent of a New York that now is increasingly does not exist, sort of industrial and residential and this sort of ruined nature. And I showed a bunch of that work at Leslie Heller Gallery. They were landscapes, largely very expressionistic. And that's kind of what led me to the Runaways. I see it as kind of a gradual insertion of myself much more into my work. I think as I've gotten older, I felt like much more confident in telling my own story. And the Runaways was the first series I did where I really put myself into my work as a self figure in this landscape that I inhabited with these animals that I was finding. So it was, and now I am where I am, where I'm really being very explicit about representing myself in my work.
And it's interesting, I think maybe not a lot, it's probably an overstatement, but I do know a lot of artists that I have personally watched over the years when they kind of start off with themselves and then progress into other types of art and representing other people. And you kind of did it the flip-flop a little bit. Well, I mean, I know that some of the earlier work was an idea of yourself, but these are meant to represent yourself as you are now. So I think that's very interesting.
I mean, I came to New York at a time when, I mean, the early 80s, think of the art that was being done then. It's
Yeah.
kind of the end of the pictures generation, conception. Well, not even the end. I mean, because Jeff Koons and Ashley Richardson and Meyer Weisman. I mean, the painters that were painting then were Schnabel, Sally, Fischel, Elizabeth Murray. I mean, it was just a really pluralistic time, but also a time when there were not a lot of, wasn't really okay to just paint the figure like now. That's what you see is young artists painting figures in one way or another, and it was a totally different climate. So in a way, the things that I'm most interested in have become normcore art, and that is really amazing. And I think actually one thing that's led to that is even though the climate now obviously highlights how unfair many worlds are to people of color and women. It's, I think figurative art is of interest to people now because it allows artists from these different groups who maybe haven't had such high visibility to represent themselves. And I think that's why that language appeals to so many young artists now, rather than abstraction, is people want to tell their stories. They want to tell their stories if they have been excluded, or they just want to tell them.
I agree with that completely. And I think that is why you have seen in the last, 5 to 10 years a shift into people being more interested in figuration and that representation of individual stories and how that is represented in art, but also from different backgrounds, different cultures, different voices. And so I think that's very interesting. I think that is why it has made that transition.
Her story in quite the same way, I think, explicitly with a line and a dot. I mean, it has to be, I think there's going to be a backlash against all of these images, but I think it just in terms of the art world's pendulum always swinging, but I do think this hunger for understanding other people and letting people tell their own stories is really behind this interest. And so that's aided, I think, the resurgence of an interest in some older artists, and that includes me, but other artists who've gained a lot of traction, like Kathy Bradford or Judith Lanier, who are always heroes of mine, whose work is now also in the mainstream. And I think artists like Dana Schutz have led to looking back at those artists, because they now appear to be have influenced young artists, whether they did or not. The work gets clawed back and then highlighted. And so that's kind of an interesting thing too, because the art world has a kind of ageism also, and now that's getting wiped away. So like 1,100 flowers are blooming, or whatever the Seitung little red book thing is, like a lot of voices get to participate. That's important.
Because there's so many voices out there that aren't heard, and that we need to hear, and we need to see the art. I'm all for the more art, the better. I want to really thank you for taking the time and talking with me about your work. I can't wait to see more of the show that you were talking about earlier that's about to open. I may not be able to see it in person, but I can at least see images.
I mean, it's going to open on June 18th at Anna's Arena. She's on 24th Street, the main drag of Chelsea, and up through the summer. I think as New York unfreezes, we're going to be allowed to have open hours, certainly by appointment. But I mean, we hope to have an opening reception later in the summer, so that people will actually be able to get together and see it in some way, socially distancing. But there isn't very much programmed, I think, for New York right now. So we're excited about it.
Yeah, that's amazing. And thank you again for taking the time.
Thank you so much, Tina. This has been an incredible pleasure. I've loved all the interviews you've done, and it's just a great initiative, I think, to connect artists and audiences, and especially in this horrible time.
One of my favorite things to do is to talk with artists and connect people, and just use art as that vehicle. So I think it's been a lot of fun for me.
Well, I'm really honored to be part of it. Thank you again.